I want to start with a question that millions of people carry quietly. Maybe a parent had it, maybe a grandparent, maybe you've watched someone in your family walk the slow, difficult road of Alzheimer's disease, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a question has been sitting there ever since. Is that my future too? If you've ever had that thought, even briefly, even in a moment you pushed away quickly, I want you to stay with me today. Because the answer to that question is far more nuanced, far more scientifically complex, and far more hopeful than most people have ever been clearly told. Here's the belief I want to challenge right at the start. Most people who have a family history of Alzheimer's assume their risk is essentially determined, that the gene is either there or it isn't, that if a parent had it, they're probably next, and that there isn't much point in worrying about something they can't change. Both sides of that belief, the fatalism and the dismissal, are incomplete, and the truth sitting between them is genuinely important. Today we're drawing from the National Institute on Aging's Alzheimer's Disease Genetics Fact Sheet, one of the most carefully reviewed summaries of current genetic research on this disease. And what it contains is a picture of Alzheimer's genetics that is considerably more nuanced, considerably more actionable, and, for most people, considerably less predetermined than the family history story suggests. There's a specific finding in this research that I want to build toward today. It involves a genetic variant that about 15 to 25% of people carry, and what that actually means for their future in ways that most people misunderstand completely. Stay with me. Let's start with some necessary foundation. Because understanding Alzheimer's genetics requires understanding what genes actually are and what they actually do, in plain language, without the complexity that usually makes people tune out. Every cell in your body contains a complete set of instructions for how to function. Those instructions are written in DNA. The DNA is organized into structures called chromosomes. And chromosomes contain thousands of smaller segments called genes. Genes are passed down from your biological parents, half from each. They carry the information that shapes your physical traits, your body's chemistry, your immune function, and your susceptibility to certain diseases. Small variations in genes, what scientists call genetic variants, can affect how a gene functions, and in some cases, those variations influence the likelihood that a person will develop a particular disease. Here's the critical distinction that most people don't understand clearly. Some genetic variants cause disease. In other words, if you have the variant, you will almost certainly develop the condition it's associated with. Sickle cell anemia works this way. Cystic fibrosis works this way. And a small number of very rare cases of Alzheimer's work this way. But most genetic variants don't cause disease. They influence risk. They shift probability. They make a condition more or less likely, without determining the outcome. This distinction matters enormously, because much of the fear around Alzheimer's genetics is based on treating risk variants as though they're the same as causal variants. They're not. And understanding that difference changes the entire conversation. So let's talk about the genetics of Alzheimer's specifically. In most cases, the vast majority of cases, Alzheimer's does not have a single genetic cause. It is influenced by multiple genes, in combination with lifestyle factors and environmental factors. Most people who develop Alzheimer's do not have a family history of the disease, and having a parent or sibling with Alzheimer's increases risk, but it does not make the disease inevitable. The National Institute on Aging's research has identified more than 80 genetic regions associated with Alzheimer's risk. 80. And of all of those regions, only 3 specific gene mutations are actually known to cause the disease. Let me say that again clearly. Of more than 80 genetic areas linked to Alzheimer's, only 3 directly cause it. Everything else shifts probability. Those 3 causal genes, APP, PSEN1, and PSEN2, are associated with what's called early-onset Alzheimer's, meaning symptoms typically appear before age 65, and sometimes much earlier. If a parent carries one of these gene variants, their child has a 50-50 chance of inheriting it. And if inherited, the probability of developing Alzheimer's early is very high. But this form of Alzheimer's is rare. It accounts for less than 10% of all Alzheimer's cases. The overwhelming majority of Alzheimer's, more than 90%, is not caused by these 3 genes. If you have a parent or grandparent who developed Alzheimer's in their 70s, 80s, or 90s, which is the most common pattern, their diagnosis does not mean you carry one of these causal genes. It means your family history is one factor among many that influence your overall risk profile. An important factor, yes. A determining one, almost certainly not. This is where most people get it wrong. They conflate family history with genetic destiny, and the science simply doesn't support that equation. Now let's talk about the most well-known genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's, because this one deserves careful, specific attention. It's called the APOE gene, and it has several versions, what scientists call alleles, with meaningfully different effects on Alzheimer's risk. The most common version is APOE epsilon 3, carried by the majority of people. Researchers believe this version has a neutral effect on Alzheimer's risk. It neither significantly increases nor decreases the likelihood of developing the disease. A second version, APOE epsilon 2, is found in roughly 5 to 10% of people. Research suggests it may actually provide some degree of protection against Alzheimer's. If Alzheimer's does develop in someone with this version, it tends to occur later in life than it would in others. The third version, APOE epsilon 4, is the one that gets the most attention and the one that generates the most anxiety. About 15 to 25% of people carry one copy of this variant. 2 to 5% carry two copies, one from each parent. APOE epsilon 4 is associated with increased risk of Alzheimer's and earlier onset of the disease in certain populations. Having one copy raises risk. Having two copies raises it further. And here is the finding I mentioned at the beginning of today's video, the one that most people misunderstand. Carrying the APOE epsilon 4 variant does not mean you will develop Alzheimer's. The research is explicit. Some people with APOE epsilon 4 never develop the disease. Let that land properly. A variant that is present in up to a quarter of the population, that is associated with increased Alzheimer's risk, and that still does not determine who gets the disease and who doesn't. It shifts the odds. It does not write the ending. And this is why doctors rarely explain this clearly enough. Consumer genetic tests can tell you whether you carry APOE epsilon 4. But knowing that number without the full context of what it means, and what it doesn't mean, can generate fear that isn't proportionate to what the science actually says. Let's talk about genetic testing, because this is a topic that a lot of people are navigating right now, especially with the rise of consumer genetic testing services that give people access to their APOE status and other genetic information without a clinical conversation to help them interpret it. The National Institute on Aging is clear on this. Genetic tests are not routinely used in clinical settings to diagnose or predict the risk of Alzheimer's. Even APOE testing, despite being technically available, cannot fully predict who will or won't develop the disease. Its primary use is in research settings, where it helps scientists identify participants who may have an elevated risk and study how the disease develops over time. If you're considering an at-home genetic test, or if you've already taken one and received information about your APOE status, the NIA's guidance is to talk with a doctor or genetic counselor to understand what the results actually mean in your specific context. Not because the information is useless, but because genetic information without clinical context is frequently misinterpreted, and that misinterpretation can generate either false reassurance or unnecessary fear. A genetic counselor is specifically trained to help people understand exactly this kind of complex, probabilistic genetic information. If Alzheimer's runs strongly in your family, or if you've received genetic test results that concern you, a referral to a genetic counselor is a conversation worth having with your doctor. The other important point about genetic testing is this: knowing your genetic risk status does not change what the most effective protective actions are. The lifestyle factors associated with lower Alzheimer's risk, physical activity, cardiovascular health management, a nutritious diet, social engagement, mental stimulation, are the same regardless of your genetic profile. If anything, knowing you carry a risk variant is an argument for taking those protective behaviors more seriously, not a reason to accept a predetermined outcome. We're now at the part of today's video I've been building toward, and I want to tell you directly, what I'm about to share is the most practically important thing in today's conversation. Because everything else, the distinction between causal genes and risk variants, the nuances of APOE testing, is important context. But this is what should actually change how you think and act. The National Institute on Aging's genetics research discusses a field called epigenetics. And this is where the conversation moves from what your genes say to what you can actually do about it. Epigenetics is the study of how external factors, exercise, diet, environmental exposures, smoking, and others, can alter the way genes function without changing the DNA sequence itself. In other words, your genes are not static. The lifestyle you lead influences which genes are more or less active. It influences how your body reads and responds to the genetic instructions it was given. This means that even if you carry a genetic variant associated with Alzheimer's risk, the lifestyle choices you make may influence how that risk is actually expressed in your body over time. The variant itself doesn't change, but its effect, the degree to which it influences your biology, is not entirely beyond your influence. This is not a fringe idea. It is a mainstream area of active scientific research, funded by the NIH and published in major scientific journals. And it is one of the most compelling scientific arguments for taking lifestyle-based brain health seriously, not as a guarantee, but as a meaningful modifier of the genetic hand you were dealt. The precision medicine research the NIA references, which considers individual variability in genes, environment, and lifestyle, is moving toward a future where your specific genetic profile will help doctors predict which prevention strategies are most likely to work for you specifically. That future isn't fully here yet, but the direction of the science is clear. What works for your brain health is not identical for everyone. Your genetics, your ancestry, your lifestyle history all contribute to a unique risk profile. And the more the research advances, the more tailored the guidance will become. Let's also address the dimension of genetic diversity in Alzheimer's research, because this is important and underrepresented in most public conversation about this topic. The NIA's genetics fact sheet specifically notes that the prevalence and risk associated with APOE and other genetic variants may not be the same across all population groups. Research suggests the degree of risk may differ among people of African, Asian, American Indian, and European descent. This matters for several reasons. First, it means that genetic risk information derived primarily from studies of European populations may not fully translate to people of other ancestries. Second, it means that researchers need diverse participation in genetic studies to develop risk assessments and treatments that work for everyone, not just the groups historically overrepresented in research. If you are from a community that has historically been underrepresented in Alzheimer's research, and many communities have been, your participation in clinical studies and research is genuinely valuable, not just for science in the abstract, for developing the specific understanding of Alzheimer's genetics and risk in your community that could eventually translate to better prevention and treatment for you and your family. Let's bring everything together now with practical actions rooted in what the science actually supports. The first is to reframe your family history from destiny to data point. If Alzheimer's runs in your family, that history is one piece of a complex risk picture, not a sentence. It's information that should prompt awareness and proactive action, not fatalism. The research does not support the conclusion that family history equals inevitable disease. The second is to approach genetic testing thoughtfully and with professional support. If you're curious about your genetic risk, whether through a clinical test or a consumer service, consider having that conversation with a doctor or genetic counselor before or alongside the testing, not just after. Understanding what a result means and what it doesn't mean is as important as having the result itself. The third is to invest in the lifestyle behaviors that research consistently associates with lower Alzheimer's risk, regardless of your genetic profile. Regular physical activity, cardiovascular health management, a nutritious, varied diet, social engagement, mental stimulation, not smoking, limiting alcohol. These are the modifiable factors that the science points to, and the epigenetics research suggests they may be especially important for people who carry genetic risk variants, because they influence how those variants are expressed in the body over time. The fourth is to have the genetic conversation with your family, honestly and productively. If Alzheimer's has affected multiple family members across generations, a conversation with your doctor about whether genetic counseling or testing is appropriate for your situation is worth having. This is particularly relevant if disease appeared at unusually young ages, before 65, in close biological relatives. And the fifth is to consider clinical trial participation. The NIA and affiliated research centers are continuously enrolling participants, including healthy adults with and without family histories of Alzheimer's, for studies that are advancing the understanding of genetics, brain health, and Alzheimer's prevention. Your participation, whatever your family history, contributes to research that will benefit future generations. The Alzheimer's.gov Clinical Trials Finder is a starting point for finding studies near you. Here's what I want you to carry with you from today. Your genes are not your fate. Not for Alzheimer's, not for most complex diseases. The science of Alzheimer's genetics is sophisticated, still evolving, and significantly more nuanced than the simple family history story most people have been told. Of the more than 80 genetic regions associated with this disease, only 3 directly cause it. The rest, including the most commonly discussed genetic risk factor, APOE epsilon 4, influence probability without determining outcome. And the emerging field of epigenetics adds another layer to this. The lifestyle you lead appears to influence how your genetic risk is actually expressed in your body, which means the choices you make every day about movement, food, sleep, cardiovascular health, social connection are not irrelevant to your genetic story. They may be, in very real ways, part of writing it. You didn't choose your genes, but you have enormous influence over the conditions in which those genes operate. That is not a small thing. That is a profound form of agency, and it is available to you every single day. The fear around Alzheimer's genetics is understandable, but fear without accurate information leads nowhere productive. Accurate information, the kind we've worked through today, leads to choices. And choices lead to a future that is at least partly shaped by your own hands. That matters. You matter. And what you do with this information matters. Before you go, I want to plant something in your mind for our next conversation. We've talked today about the genetics of Alzheimer's, what the science says and what it doesn't say. But there's a related topic that almost nobody addresses directly, and that I think is one of the most important conversations families can have when Alzheimer's is part of their history. It involves how to talk to your children or younger family members about genetic risk, what to tell them, when to tell them, how to frame information that is both important and potentially frightening in a way that leads to empowerment rather than anxiety. These conversations are delicate, and there are specific approaches that the research and counseling community have identified as more helpful than others. That's coming up next. And if you want to be there for it, if you want to keep getting honest, clear, science-grounded guidance on the topics that matter most for aging well and protecting the people you love, subscribe to this channel. Take good care of yourself. Your brain, your history, and your future are worth understanding clearly.